Oxygen tastes like copper when life support is failing. That was the first thing Cameron noticed. The evacuation shuttle had torn away from the docking ring 20 minutes ago, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made his eardrums throb. They hadn't left him out of malice. They left him because his mass exceeded the optimal fuel-to-weight ratio for a profitable retreat. Now, he was the sole heir to a crumbling alien way station, and survival wasn't a heroic calling. It was just an unpaid invoice. Vibrations from the departing thrusters still hummed through the soles of Cameron's boots. He stood on the observation deck, a heavy, grease-stained man in his early 50s, watching the blue flare of the Vaughn transport shrink into the ink of deep space. It vanished. No warp flash, just a slow fading into nothing, like a dying ember dropped in snow. Silence rushed in to fill the void. It wasn't a quiet, peaceful silence. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a tomb being sealed. The ambient hum of the station, the soft, organic pulsing that the Vaughn used for everything from gravity plating to air circulation, was stuttering. Cameron ran a calloused hand over his face. His fingers smelled like synthetic lubricant and stale sweat. He swallowed hard, trying to dislodge the dry lump in his throat. Panic is a funny thing. You expect it to be loud, a screaming voice in your head telling you to run. Instead, it was a cold, leaden weight in his gut, a creeping numbness spreading down his arms. "Okay," Cameron breathed to the empty room. "Okay, let's do the math." He turned away from the viewport. The Vaughn architecture around him was beautiful, in a sterile, insectoid way. Smooth, iridescent bulkheads that curved without a single hard angle or visible seam. But right now, the pearlescent walls were dimming, shifting from their healthy, bioluminescent blue to a sickly, bruised purple. The Vaughn were creatures of absolute logic. When the station's central core began to destabilize beyond the parameters of their repair algorithms, they calculated the cost of fixing it against the cost of abandoning it. Abandonment won. They packed up their essential data, loaded the shuttle, and left. Cameron was a contracted human engineer, hired to maintain the few pieces of crude Terran tech they had permitted on board. When the evacuation order came, the Vaughn overseer hadn't locked him out. He had simply handed Cameron a datapad. Cameron pulled that datapad from his coverall pocket now. The screen glowed faintly in the dimming light. Evacuation manifest. Total allowable organic mass, 4,200 kilograms. Current Vaughn personnel mass, 4,120 kilograms. Human contractor mass, 98 kilograms. Overage, 18 kilograms. Contract terminated. Have a productive expiration. They hadn't even considered leaving someone else behind. To them, he was a rounding error, a liability of flesh and bone. His chest tightened, his breath hitched, coming short and shallow. The urge to fall to his knees, to scream at the unblinking stars, surged upward, tasting like bile. He actually gagged, bending over with his hands on his knees, staring at his scuffed steel-toed boots. He spat a wad of saliva onto the floorless deck. "Breathe, you old bastard," he muttered, the words raspy. "You're not dying in a tin can built by oversized crickets." He forced himself upright. The panic didn't leave, but he compartmentalized it, shoving it into a tight, dark box in the back of his mind. He needed a distraction. He needed a problem to solve. The lights flickered, dipping dangerously low before surging back. A low, bass-heavy groan vibrated through the floorboards. The station's core was entering the final stages of cascading failure. Without power, the magnetic shielding holding back the vacuum of space would dissolve, and the station would simply pop like a soap bubble. Cameron hefted his tool belt. It was heavy, laden with wrenches, plasma torches, analog meters, and spools of conductive wire, crude instruments of brute force compared to the delicate sonic tuners the Vaughn used. But brute force was all he had. He keyed the access panel to the central elevator. Nothing happened. The Vaughn systems had already cordoned off non-essential sectors to preserve power. "Right," Cameron grunted, drawing a heavy, solid steel crowbar from his belt. "We're doing this the human way." He wedged the flat edge of the bar into the microscopic seam of the elevator doors and threw his weight against it. His bad left knee screamed in protest. Tendons in his neck stood out like cords. The doors fought back, their magnetic locks whining in a high-pitched frequency that made his teeth ache. With a sickening crack, the lock gave way. The doors slid apart just enough for Cameron to squeeze through. He stared down into the pitch-black shaft. The smell of rotting cabbage, the signature scent of decaying Vaughn coolant, wafted up, thick and cloying. He clicked on his shoulder lamp. A narrow maintenance ladder, slick with condensation, spiraled down into the abyss. "Just a walk in the park," he whispered, wiping grease from his forehead. He grabbed the first rung and began the long climb down into the dying heart of the station. The descent took an hour. The air grew steadily thinner, colder. Each breath scraped against Cameron's lungs like fiberglass. The ambient gravity was failing in pockets, making him feel momentarily weightless before slamming him back down against the rungs with bone-jarring force. He didn't think about the vacuum outside. He didn't think about Earth, or the ex-wife who had stopped answering his comms 3 years ago, or the mountain of debt that had driven him to take a contract on a godforsaken alien outpost. He thought only about his hands. Reach, grip, step, reach, grip, step. Finally, his boots hit solid decking. He was in the primary engineering level. The air here was a humid swamp of chemical fumes and ozone. The walls weren't smooth and pearlescent down here. They were a tangled mess of crystalline conduits and pulsating, fleshy-looking tubes that pumped the station's lifeblood. At the center of the cavernous room hung the core. It was a sphere of containment glass, suspended by massive magnetic pylons. Inside, a swirling storm of violet plasma raged, beautiful and terrifying. But the containment field was failing. Spiderwebs of microfractures marred the glass, leaking harsh, unfiltered radiation. The Von cooling system, a network of delicate glass-like capillaries feeding into the core, was shattered in half a dozen places, bleeding that cabbage-smelling coolant onto the floor. Cameron approached the main diagnostic console. It was a fluid touch interface. He hated the damn things. You didn't press buttons. You had to dip your fingers into a pool of conductive gel and let the system read your neural impulses. He grimaced, plunging his hand into the viscous blue sludge. The console illuminated, projecting a holographic display of the core's stability matrix. Numbers and alien glyphs cascaded in frantic red bursts. Cameron couldn't read Von syntax fluently, but he knew universal engineering principles: heat, pressure, flow. The primary thermal regulators were fried. The Von design was entirely dependent on perfect harmony. If Node A failed, Node B tried to compensate. But because Node B was designed for a specific tolerance, it would overload and fail, triggering a cascade that took down the whole grid. It was an elegant system, provided nothing ever went wrong. "Stupid," Cameron muttered, ripping his hand out of the gel and wiping it on his pants. "Brilliant, but stupid." Human engineering, by contrast, was built on the assumption that everything would eventually break. It was built with redundancies, bypasses, and ugly, bolted-on solutions. The core temperature was rising. He had maybe 40 minutes before the plasma burned through the containment glass and flash incinerated everything within a 3-mile radius. Cameron dropped his tool bag onto the deck with a heavy metallic clatter. The sound was deafening in the vast, humming room. He cracked his knuckles, feeling the familiar, comforting ache in his joints. "All right, you overgrown chandelier," he said, staring up at the raging plasma storm. "Let's see how you like a little duct tape and ignorance." He grabbed his plasma torch and a spool of heavy-gauge copper cabling. The first problem was the coolant leak. The Von system relied on acoustic frequencies to patch micro-tears in their organic tubing, but the sonic emitters were dead. Cameron didn't have a sonic emitter. He had a welding torch and thermal sealant. He dragged himself under the primary feed lines. The deck was slick with the spilled coolant. It soaked through the knees of his coveralls, stinging his skin like a mild acid. He gritted his teeth, ignoring the burn. He found the largest rupture. The crystalline tube was splintered, jagged edges, weeping fluid. He didn't try to repair the delicate crystal. Instead, he took a heavy steel sleeve from his kit, a piece meant for standard Terran plumbing, and wrapped it around the broken alien tube. It didn't fit. The Von tube was an irregular oval. "Come on," he grunted, sweat stinging his eyes. He grabbed a heavy mallet and began pounding the steel sleeve, forcing the metal to bend and deform around the crystal. The noise was brutal, a harsh, percussive clang, clang, clang that echoed violently against the organic hum of the alien tech. The crystal groaned, threatening to shatter completely under his abuse. Cameron held his breath, tapping the sleeve one last time until it bit into the tubing. He grabbed his thermal sealant, an industrial-grade epoxy that hardened like concrete, and sprayed a thick, ugly glob of it around the edges of the steel sleeve. It hissed, sending up a cloud of acrid smoke that made him cough violently. His lungs burned, but the leaking stopped. "One down," he wheezed, rolling out from under the pipes. He wiped his greasy forehead, smearing black soot across his skin. 400 to go. For the next 30 minutes, Cameron became a machine of desperate, ugly creation. He moved through the engineering bay with a frantic, stumbling energy. His hands were slick with blood from a dozen small cuts, inflicted by the razor-sharp edges of shattered Von crystals. He didn't feel the pain. Adrenaline had narrowed his world down to a tunnel vision of immediate problems and crude solutions. The primary regulators were beyond repair. Their delicate neural weave circuitry was burned to ash. The core's internal pressure was redlining, the violet plasma inside the containment sphere churning violently, throwing off blinding arcs of static electricity that raised the hair on Cameron's arms. "Bypass," he muttered to himself, frantically stripping the insulation off a length of copper cable with his teeth. He spat the rubber out. "Just bypass the whole damn neural network." He was attempting something that would have given a Von engineer a stroke. He was going to hotwire a zero-point energy core using analog conductive cables and a manual breaker switch salvaged from a scrapped human freighter. He climbed the magnetic pylon, his boots slipping on the slick metal. The heat radiating from the core was blistering. It felt like standing in front of an open blast furnace. Sweat poured down his face, evaporating almost instantly off his collar. He reached the primary junction box. The cover was sealed with a biometric lock. Cameron didn't have time to slice the lock. He took his crowbar and smashed the heavy iron tool directly into the center of the console. The delicate glass faceplate shattered in a shower of sparks. He reached into the ruined console, ignoring the sharp sting of electricity biting at his fingertips, and ripped out the fried neural weave bundle. He jammed the raw, exposed ends of his copper cabling directly into the power coupling, securing it with a massive clamp. "Hold together, you piece of junk," he prayed, wrapping the connection in 3 layers of industrial flex tape. He ran the heavy cable down the pylon, trailing it across the deck to a makeshift control station he had hastily assembled on top of an empty supply crate. At the center of the crate sat the massive, heavy-duty mechanical breaker switch. It was archaic. It was purely mechanical. The warning klaxons finally kicked in, a high-pitched, mournful wail that signaled imminent catastrophic failure. The containment glass was glowing cherry red. Cameron scrambled to the crate. His heart was hammering against his ribs so hard it physically hurt. He grabbed the heavy lever of the breaker switch. "In 3, 2, 1, he growled and slammed the lever upward. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. The silence stretched, tight and agonizing. Then, a massive thud shook the station. It wasn't the organic hum of the Von. It was the violent, percussive concussion of raw electricity being forced through analog copper. The cables on the floor violently whipped and snapped, sparks showering into the air like fireworks. The violet plasma in the core surged, flashing a blinding, pure white. Cameron threw his arms over his face, expecting the heat of vaporizing fire. Instead, the station shuddered. The heavy steel sleeve he had hammered onto the coolant line groaned, but it held. The manual bypass forced the pressure out of the primary chamber and into the secondary exhaust vents. The howling klaxons died. The blinding light faded back to a manageable, steady violet. Cameron slowly lowered his arms. His breathing was ragged, echoing loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. Above him, the ambient lighting flickered, but it didn't return to the soft, iridescent blue of the Von. Instead, powered by the jury-rigged human bypass, the overhead panels buzzed and ignited in a harsh, flickering yellow-amber glare. It cast long, sharp shadows across the room, illuminating the ugly steel patches, the tangled copper wires, and the thick globs of sealant. The station was alive. It sounded different now. The smooth, silent hum was gone, replaced by a low, mechanical grinding and the audible rush of fluids through restricted pipes. It sounded like a massive, wounded beast breathing through its teeth. Cameron collapsed against the supply crate, sliding down to the floor. His legs simply refused to hold him anymore. He looked at his hands. They were trembling violently, covered in grease, alien fluid, and his own blood. He began to laugh. It started as a dry, coughing wheeze and grew into a loud, booming bark that echoed off the ruined bulkheads. "Calculated by tonnage," he laughed, wiping a tear of sheer relief from his soot-stained cheek. "You stupid bugs. You forgot to account for spite." He sat there for a long time, listening to the ugly, beautiful heartbeat of the monster he had just stitched together. He had bought himself time, but as he looked around the massive engineering bay at the hundreds of other failing systems blinking warning lights in the amber gloom, the reality of his situation settled over him like a lead blanket. He hadn't saved the station. He had just put it on life support. If he wanted to live to see another sunrise, he was going to have to rebuild the whole damn thing, one ugly steel patch at a time. Exhaustion settled into Cameron's bones, not as a sudden wave, but as a slow, creeping paralysis. He lay on the cold decking of the engineering bay for what might have been 10 minutes or 3 hours. The harsh, amber emergency lights flickered, casting erratic, jerking shadows across the bulkheads. Above him, the massive core churned with an ugly mechanical rhythm. The jury-rigged bypass cables vibrated violently against the floorboards, a constant physical reminder of his crude, desperate hack. Thirst woke him. It started as a dry scratch at the back of his throat, rapidly escalating into a sensation of swallowing sand. He ran a thick, grease-stained tongue over his cracked lips. He tasted salt, old copper, and the bitter residue of vaporized Von coolant. Cameron pushed himself up. His left knee popped loudly, sending a sharp, electrical jolt of pain up his thigh. He grunted, leaning heavily against the empty supply crate that housed his makeshift manual breaker switch. His coveralls were stiff with dried sweat and hardened chemical spills. Every movement sounded like crinkling plastic. He needed water. The Von didn't use standard liquid reservoirs. Their entire station was a living, breathing organism. They hydrated through a localized ambient humidity system controlled by a massive hydroponic lung situated 3 decks above engineering. The Von simply absorbed moisture through their exoskeletons and respiratory spiracles. Cameron, cursed with mammalian biology, needed to drink liquid water. Before the evacuation, he had survived on a limited supply of bottled rations shipped in from a Terran freighter. Those were gone. He had consumed the last plastic pouch 2 days ago. He hefted his tool bag. It felt 10 pounds heavier than it had an hour ago. He slung the strap over his aching shoulder and limped toward the secondary access corridor. The corridor was a narrow, ribbed tunnel designed for beings that moved horizontally on multiple limbs. Cameron had to crouch slightly, his broad shoulders brushing against the damp, fleshy-feeling walls. The bioluminescent veins that usually pulsed with a soft blue light were completely dark, choked off by his power bypass. The only illumination came from the shaky beam of his shoulder-mounted halogen lamp. The air grew steadily warmer as he climbed the maintenance shaft toward the hydroponic lung. It wasn't a clean, dry heat. It was a thick, suffocating humidity that smelled of rotting vegetation and ammonia. The Von algae vats were dying. Without the precise temperature controls of the main core, the delicate alien flora was rapidly decaying into a toxic sludge. He pried open the access hatch to the hydroponics bay. A wave of putrid, foul-smelling steam hit him square in the face. Cameron gagged, immediately slapping a hand over his mouth and nose. His eyes watered. The bay was a cavernous dome. Suspended from the ceiling were hundreds of translucent, gelatinous sacs, each the size of a transport shuttle. They were supposed to be vibrant green, filtering the station's carbon dioxide and exhaling purified oxygen and moisture. Now they were a sickly, bruised brown. Several had already ruptured, spilling thick, foul-smelling slime onto the grated floor. Cameron stepped carefully, his steel-toed boots sliding on the wet grating. He approached the primary condensation collection trough. It was a long, curved channel of smoothed, bone-like material where the ambient moisture was supposed to pool. It was completely dry. The heating elements beneath the floor were running unchecked, baking the moisture out of the air and turning the bay into a stagnant sauna. "Beautiful," Cameron croaked, his voice cracking. He coughed, spitting a glob of phlegm onto the grating. "Just beautiful." He couldn't fix the Von biological systems. He possessed neither the chemical compounds nor the subtle sonic tuners required to coax the alien algae back to life. But physics was universal. Water vapor existed in this room. He just needed to trap it, cool it, and condense it before it mixed with the ammonia-rich decay of the rotting sacks. He dropped his tool bag with a heavy clatter. He needed a condenser. Cameron scavenged the bay, dragging his bad leg. He found a discarded length of Terran-grade aluminum ventilation ducting, a remnant of a previous attempt to install a standard air scrubber. It was wide, hollow, and conductive. He dragged the heavy ducting over to the primary environmental exhaust vent. The vent was spewing a localized stream of superheated, moisture-rich air straight from the dying algae vats below. "Okay, phase 1, Cameron muttered to himself. He wiped sweat from his eyes, leaving a streak of black grease across his forehead. He jammed one end of the aluminum ducting directly over the exhaust vent, using a heavy roll of industrial foil tape to seal the clumsy connection. The duct immediately began to heat up, vibrating as the pressurized steam forced its way inside. Now he needed to cool the vapor. He needed a heat sink. He remembered the ambient coolant lines running through the outer hull plating. The Von used the natural vacuum of space to chill their secondary fluids. Cameron left the hydroponics bay, moving with a desperate, frantic energy, and climbed a narrow service ladder toward the station's outer skin. The temperature plummeted the higher he climbed. Frost gathered on the edges of his collar. He found a secondary coolant capillary. It was a thick, crystalline tube carrying semi-frozen liquid. Cameron didn't hesitate. He drew his heavy steel crowbar and smashed it against the crystalline pipe. The material shattered. Slushy, freezing blue fluid sprayed out, instantly crystallizing on Cameron's coveralls. It burned with cold. He ignored the stinging pain, quickly grabbing a rubberized containment sleeve from his kit and clamping it over the broken pipe to catch the flow. He ran a narrow, flexible hose from the containment sleeve all the way back down the shaft to the hydroponics bay. His hands were numb, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive from the freezing fluid. Back in the sweltering heat of the bay, he wrapped the freezing hose tightly around the exterior of the aluminum ventilation duct. The contrast was immediate and violent. The superheated steam inside the duct hit the freezing aluminum exterior. Condensation formed instantly. Cameron positioned a plastic storage crate beneath the open end of the aluminum duct. He waited. He stared at the empty crate, his breathing shallow, his hands gripping the railing so hard his knuckles were white. A single drop of water formed at the lip of the aluminum duct. It hung there, trembling, catching the harsh amber light of the emergency panels. Then it fell. Plink. A second drop followed. Plink. Then a slow, steady, agonizingly thin trickle. Cameron didn't wait for the crate to fill. He threw himself onto his knees, shoving his cupped hands under the trickle. The water was lukewarm and tasted heavily of aluminum dust and stale ozone, but as it hit the back of his throat, it was the greatest thing he had ever consumed. He drank greedily, coughing as the water went down the wrong pipe, water spilling over his chin and washing tracks of clean skin through the grime on his neck. He sat back on his heels, gasping for air, staring at the makeshift still. He had water. It was an ugly, inefficient, brute force solution that was slowly destroying the station's secondary cooling loop, but it was water. Cameron leaned his head back against the humid bulkhead and closed his eyes. The panic in his chest had subsided into a dull, manageable ache. He was alive, for now. But as he sat there, listening to the hissing steam and the dripping water, a new sound registered in his ears. It wasn't the station. It was a hollow, rhythmic thumping, resonating through the hull plating, micro-meteorites. Without the main core running at full capacity, the station's deflector shields were completely offline. The outer hull was taking direct impacts. Cameron opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. The calculus of survival was ruthless. You solve one equation, and a harder one immediately takes its place. "No rest for the wicked," he whispered, forcing himself back to his feet. He grabbed his wrench. The heavy iron felt comforting in his bruised palm. It was time to go to the outer hull. Climbing the central access spire felt like crawling up the inside of a massive frozen chimney. The gravity plating in this sector had completely failed. Cameron floated upward, pulling himself along the rusted rungs of an emergency maintenance ladder. The lack of gravity was a blessing for his ruined knee, but it wreaked havoc on his stomach. Every jerky pull sent a wave of nausea washing through him. He was heading for the communications relay. If the hull was taking impacts, He needed to know the trajectory and density of the debris field. More importantly, he needed to see if the Von transport had left a transponder beacon in their wake. He needed to cast a line into the dark. The comm center was located at the very peak of the station, a blister of sensory equipment protruding from the main hull. When Cameron finally wrenched the manual hatch open, he was met with absolute zero-G chaos. The room was devastated. The Von hadn't just abandoned the station, they had systematically sabotaged the long-range arrays to prevent corporate espionage. Severed fiber optic cables floated in the air like metallic seaweed. The primary neural interface pool, a wide, shallow basin of conductive gel used to control the sensors, had been flash-frozen. The gel turned into a hard, cracked disk of blue ice. Cameron anchored his boots to the magnetic floor plates. The sudden tethering pulled at his calves. He floated there for a moment, letting his erratic heartbeat slow. "Bastards!" he breathed, his breath puffing in visible white clouds. The environmental heaters in the spire were dead. He moved toward the primary console. The Von equipment was organic and smooth, completely devoid of keypads, dials, or screens. It relied entirely on the biological interface of the gel pool. Cameron pulled a heavy pair of insulated wire cutters from his belt. "Let's see what's under the hood." He bypassed the frozen pool entirely, striking the console's outer casing with the flat side of his heavy crowbar. The casing, brittle from the freezing temperatures, cracked like an eggshell. He pried the pieces apart, exposing the dense, complex nervous system of the console. Thousands of hair-thin, bioluminescent threads were tightly woven into intricate geometric patterns. It was beautiful, far beyond human technological capabilities. Cameron grabbed a handful of the delicate threads and ruthlessly ripped them out. He didn't need to understand Von data packets. He didn't need to decipher their encrypted communication protocols. He just needed raw power and a transmitter. He dug through the exposed guts of the console until he found the main power coupling for the external broadcasting dish. It was a thick braided cable pulsing with a faint residual green light. He sliced the cable clean in half. From his tool bag, he produced a heavy, blocky Terran diagnostic terminal. It was a rugged, outdated piece of machinery, scarred with deep scratches and held together with strips of black tape. It had a physical keyboard that clicked loudly when pressed. He spliced the raw wires of the Von transmitter directly into the analog input port of his terminal. He used cheap copper clamps, wrapping the connection tightly in electrical tape to prevent arcing. He booted up the terminal. The small, monochrome green screen flickered to life, casting an eerie glow on Cameron's tired face. The terminal immediately screamed a dozen error codes. It couldn't read the alien hardware. Cameron ignored the errors. He opened a raw, unformatted command prompt. He was going to bypass the digital translation entirely. He was going to use the massive Von broadcasting dish to send a localized surge of electromagnetic static. He would pulse the power manually, on-off, on-off. He was going to tap out an SOS in deep space, using a 10 billion credit alien communication array as a giant telegraph key. His fingers hovered over the terminal's manual override switch. He hesitated. A ghost crawled into his mind. It was the memory of a tiny, cramped apartment in Neo-Chicago, smelling of burned synthetic coffee and cheap raincoats. He remembered a voice, Dakota's voice. "You always fix the things that don't matter, Cameron. You fix engines, you fix valves, but you leave when things get heavy." She wasn't wrong. He had taken the off-world contracts to run away from a collapsing marriage and a mountain of debt. He was a coward who preferred the predictable logic of machines to the messy, unsolvable complexities of human relationships. And now, here he was, alone, billions of miles from anyone who even knew his name, fighting desperately to stay alive in a tin can that was slowly trying to kill him. Why? What was he fighting for? To go back to an empty apartment? To go back to creditors and failure? Cameron stared at the blinking green cursor on the terminal screen. The silence of the freezing room pressed heavily against his eardrums. He could just let go. He could unanchor his boots, float in the dark, and let the cold take him. It would be easy. It would be peaceful. The Von had done the math, and the math said his life held zero value. His jaw tightened. A familiar dark anger flared in his chest, burning away the cold creeping into his veins. "To hell with their math!" Cameron snarled into the empty room. He slammed his heavy finger down on the manual override key. Outside the hull, The massive, silent broadcasting dish surged with raw, unformatted power. Click. He held the key down. 3 short pulses. Click, click, click. 3 long pulses. Click, hold, click, hold, click, hold. 3 short pulses. He fell into a rhythm. His finger hammered the key, sending shockwaves of raw electromagnetic static out into the void. It wasn't a message. It was a scream. It was the violent, noisy, undeniable assertion of his own existence. He sat in the freezing dark, his breath pluming in the air, his grease-stained hands moving with mechanical precision. He didn't know if anyone was listening. He didn't know if the signal was even breaking through the atmospheric interference of the sector. But as he hammered the key, feeling the physical recoil of the heavy machinery, the ghost of his past faded. He wasn't running anymore. There was nowhere left to run. He was Cameron, a heavy-set, cynical mechanic with a bad knee and a mountain of regret. And he was taking a stand on an alien scrap heap. He tapped the code again and again until his finger bled, leaving a smear of crimson on the plastic key. He would make them hear him. He would make the universe acknowledge that he was here, that he was human, and that he refused to be easily erased. Hypoxia does not announce itself with a warning chime. It creeps in through the back door of your consciousness, dressed as a warm, comforting blanket. Cameron first noticed it when he stopped caring about the freezing temperatures of the communications spire. The bone-deep chill that had been rattling his teeth suddenly felt like a mild, pleasant breeze. He stopped tapping the telegraph key. His bloody finger hovered over the plastic button, trembling not from the cold but from a profound, terrifying lethargy. Black spots danced in the periphery of his vision. They swarmed like gnats, multiplying with every shallow breath. Shh! A sound pulled him from the edge of sleep. It was faint, high-pitched, and completely out of place in the dead silence of the zero-gravity compartment. It sounded like an angry viper. Cameron blinked, trying to force his eyes to focus on the amber emergency lights. The micro-meteorites. He had felt the dull thuds vibrating through the hull plating earlier, but he had ignored them, entirely focused on his desperate broadcast. Now, the station was paying the toll. The outer skin had been breached. Air, Cameron mumbled, his voice sounding thick and distant to his own ears. Losing air. He unanchored his magnetic boots with a sluggish, uncoordinated slap of his hand against his thigh controls. The sudden weightlessness sent him drifting upward, bumping gently against the frozen, ruined console. His mind felt like it was submerged in syrup. The logical part of his brain, the engineer, was screaming at him to move, to find the breach, to patch it before the pressure differential sucked his lungs out through his nose. The mammalian part of his brain just wanted to close its eyes and float in the dark. He bit his own tongue, hard. The sharp, metallic tang of blood flooded his mouth, accompanied by a jolt of pain that cut through the hypoxic fog. He gasped, his chest heaving, trying to pull oxygen from a room that was rapidly bleeding it out into the void of space. "Move!" he snarled, grabbing the edge of the access ladder and hauling himself downward. He practically fell down the maintenance shaft, his boots glancing off the rungs in a clumsy, desperate descent. As he reached the lower level, gravity returned with a vicious snap. He hit the deck plating hard, twisting his bad knee. A loud pop echoed in the corridor, followed by a flare of agony so intense it made him vomit a mouthful of acidic bile and lukewarm condenser water onto his boots. He didn't have time to coddle the injury. The whistling sound was louder down here. He dragged himself down the fleshy-feeling Von corridor. The walls, deprived of power, were turning a sickly shade of grey, the biological material necrotizing in the dropping temperatures. He rounded a corner and found the breach. It was a jagged hole, no bigger than a silver dollar, punched straight through the iridescent bulkheads by a rock moving at 40,000 miles an hour. The escaping air was creating a localized vortex, pulling loose debris, frozen condensation, and dust out into the unforgiving vacuum. Cameron didn't have a Von synthetic tissue patch. He didn't have sonic welders or molecular adhesives. He had a toolkit designed for crude, heavy machinery. He reached to his tool belt, his fingers numb and clumsy. He fumbled, dropping his heavy wrench onto the deck. It clattered loudly, rolling toward the breach, where the vacuum instantly caught it and sucked it flat against the jagged hole. The wrench stuck there, momentarily plugging the gap. The screeching whistle dropped to a low hiss. Cameron collapsed against the opposite bulkhead, his chest heaving, staring at the wrench. It was a temporary stay of execution. The vacuum was pulling with thousands of pounds of force. Eventually, the alien material around the breach would splinter under the strain, and the hole would widen, taking the wrench, the bulkhead, and Cameron with it. He needed a permanent plug, something that would expand and cure under extreme temperature differentials. He looked at his hands, then at his heavy, insulated coveralls. The lining of his suit was made of a dense, thermoreactive polymer designed to protect engineers from plasma burns and extreme cold. It melted at high heat and hardened into a dense, impenetrable slag when exposed to sub-zero temperatures. He drew his plasma torch. The heavy cylinder felt like a lead weight in his exhausted grip. He dialed the nozzle to a wide, low-intensity dispersion. "Sorry, old friend," he rasped, pressing the hot nozzle directly against his left forearm. The heavy fabric of his coveralls immediately began to smoke. The smell of burning synthetic polymer filled the tight corridor, acrid and sickening. The heat transferred through the lining, blistering the skin on his arm. Cameron gritted his teeth, letting out a low, guttural groan that vibrated in his chest. He dragged the torch down to his wrist, melting a large, sticky patch of the thermal polymer. He dropped the torch. With his right hand, he drew a serrated utility knife and frantically sawed at the melted, bubbling fabric, ripping a large chunk of it away from his own sleeve. He exposed his bare arm to the freezing air of the corridor. The cold bit into his blistered skin like a swarm of angry hornets. He grabbed the wrench, plugging the hole. 3, 2, 1. He yanked the wrench away. The vacuum shrieked, instantly grabbing at Cameron's hair and clothes, trying to pull him into the dark. He slammed the molten wad of thermopolymer directly into the jagged hole, pressing his bare palm against the red-hot material to force it deep into the breach. The pain was absolute. It eclipsed the cold, the exhaustion, and the fear. The vacuum pulled the polymer outward, while the absolute zero of space flash froze the exterior. The molten slag expanded rapidly, gripping the edges of the shattered Von bulkhead like a vice, curing into a dense, ugly knot of hardened black plastic. Cameron held his hand there, pressing his blistered palm against the curing patch until the whistling stopped entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. He pulled his hand back. A thin layer of his skin peeled away, stuck to the frozen polymer. He didn't even wince. He just stared at the ugly, blackened scar on the pristine alien wall. It was a brutal, destructive, human solution, and it held. He sank to the floor, wrapping his raw, exposed arm against his chest. He closed his eyes, his breathing ragged and shallow. He had bought himself another hour, but the station was bleeding from a dozen other wounds, and he only had so much fabric and so much skin left to burn. Digital shrieks ripped through the deck plating, completely different from the mournful wail of the earlier evacuation klaxons. This sound was aggressive. It was sharp, chaotic, and pulsing with a frantic rhythm that rattled the fillings in Cameron's teeth. The station was waking up. Cameron opened his eyes, the amber emergency lighting violently strobing overhead. He dragged himself upright, leaning heavily against the sealed micrometeorite patch. His left arm throbbed with a dull, nauseating rhythm, the burn blistering angrily in the cold air. He didn't need to speak Von to understand what was happening. The station's automated damage control subroutines, dormant during the power crisis, had finally rebooted on his jury-rigged analog power supply, and they did not like what they saw. To the Von AI, Cameron's crude bypasses, copper wires, and smashed consoles weren't repairs. They were a virus, a massive systemic infection of foreign, incompatible hardware that was actively mutating the station's delicate neural architecture. The station wasn't trying to save him. It was trying to amputate the infected limbs. A heavy, organic grinding sound echoed down the corridor. Cameron watched in horror as a massive containment door, a thick slab of calcified Von resin, slid out from the ceiling, slamming down into the deck with a bone-jarring thud. It sealed off the corridor leading back to the hydroponics bay and his only water supply. "No, no, no," Cameron muttered, limping forward. Another door slammed down behind him, then another, 50 yards ahead. The AI was isolating the infected sectors. It was locking down engineering, and by extension, locking down Cameron. The air scrubbers in his sealed section shut down with a pathetic, dying wheeze. The temperature controls plummeted. The AI was trying to freeze the virus out, suffocating it in the dark. Cameron dragged his bad leg toward the nearest terminal access point. He smashed the delicate glass interface with the butt of his plasma torch, exposing the bioluminescent neural threads beneath. He didn't have time to splice wires. He needed to predict the AI's purge cycle. If the AI deemed the localized infection terminal, it would initiate an atmospheric purge. It would open the exterior airlocks and vent the entire engineering sector to space. He stared at the pulsing threads, his mind racing through the physics of decompression. The volume of the engineering bay was massive. The airlock vents were relatively small. If he could reach the central processing node, the brain of the damage control system, before the vacuum pulled him out, he could smash it. He could lobotomize the station, but he had to know exactly how long he had. If he timed it wrong, he would be crushed by the pressure differential or sucked into the void. He pulled a grease pencil from his pocket and began scribbling frantically on the pristine, smooth bulkhead, his handwriting jerky and chaotic. He fell back on the one thing that never lied: math. He needed to calculate the time it would take for the pressure to drop to a lethal level. He approximated the vent as a sonic orifice. He stared at the equation. The discharge coefficient for Von architecture was unknown, but he assumed a worst-case scenario of the area of the purge vents was roughly 2 square meters. The specific heat ratio for the station's oxygen-nitrogen mix was. He worked the differential equation in his head, scribbling the simplified integration on the wall. He needed to reach the server room before the pressure dropped below atmospheres, the point where his lungs would stop functioning and his blood would begin to boil. He crunched the rough numbers, slashing a heavy underline beneath the final result. 42 seconds, he breathed, wiping sweat and soot from his eyes. 42 seconds from the moment the AI initiated the purge. The strobing amber lights suddenly turned a violent, bloody red. A deep mechanical voice, a computerized translation of Von clicks and hums, echoed from the hidden speakers. Anomaly detected in primary engineering. Sterilization protocols engaged. The massive exterior airlock seals at the far end of the bay fired with explosive force. The sound was deafening. It wasn't a hiss, it was a roar. The atmosphere in the massive bay rushed toward the open vents, creating a localized hurricane. Dust, loose tools, and shattered crystal whipped past Cameron, tearing at his clothes. The pressure dropped instantly. Cameron's ears popped with agonizing force. The air turned freezing cold as the rapid expansion sucked the heat from the room. He grabbed the heavy iron handrail running along the bulkhead and pulled himself forward. 40. He dragged his bad leg, hand over hand, fighting a wind that felt like a solid wall of ice pressing against his chest. 35. Debris pelted his face. A heavy metal bolt struck his cheek, tearing the skin, but he didn't feel it. Adrenaline flooded his system, masking the pain of his blistered arm and his ruined knee. He focused entirely on the heavy, reinforced door of the server room 30 yards away. 25. His lungs began to burn. The air was getting thin. Every breath yielded less oxygen, making his muscles scream in protest. Black spots returned to his vision, swarming thicker this time. 15. He reached the server room door. It was locked, a thick slab of Von resin. He didn't have time to pry it. He didn't have time to hack it. He pulled the last block of mining explosive from his tool belt, a crude, unstable putty used for clearing asteroid debris. He slapped it directly onto the center of the resin door, jammed a detonator cap into the putty, and smashed his fist against the primer. He threw himself backward, wrapping his arms around the iron handrail. The explosion was muted in the thinning atmosphere, a dull, concussive thump that shook the deck plating. The resin door shattered into a million jagged pieces, sucked instantly outward by the vacuum. 5. Cameron scrambled through the smoking, jagged hole. The server room was small, dominated by a massive, glowing pillar of pulsing blue organic matter. The brain. He couldn't breathe. His chest heaved. But there was nothing to inhale. His vision was tunneling, shrinking down to a tiny pinprick of light. 0. With the last ounce of strength in his failing, oxygen-starved muscles, Cameron raised his heavy steel crowbar above his head. He didn't aim for a delicate component. He aimed for the center of the pulsing blue mass. He brought the heavy iron down with all the fury, spite and desperate will to live he possessed. The crowbar sank deep into the biological processor. The blue light flickered violently, then exploded in a shower of thick, foul-smelling sap. The organic pillar shrieked, a terrible, high-pitched biological sound that died rapidly into silence. The red sterilization lights cut out. With a heavy, grinding groan, the massive exterior airlocks slammed shut. The hurricane of escaping air died instantly. The localized life support scrubbers in the server room, disconnected from the main hive mind, sputtered and kicked back on, coughing a thin, pathetic stream of warm, oxygen-rich air into the small space. Cameron collapsed onto his back, lying in the pool of alien sap. He stared up at the ruined ceiling, taking shallow, desperate gulps of the thin air. His chest burned, his face was bleeding, and his body was completely broken. He let out a ragged, wheezing laugh that echoed in the tiny room. "Consider yourself," he coughed, tasting copper and dust, reformatted. Fluid dripped from the shattered remnants of the central processor, pooling around Cameron's boots in thick, viscous puddles. The smell was horrendous, a cloying, nauseating mixture of rotting fruit and scorched silicon that clung to the back of his throat. He lay there for a long time, listening to the wheezing mechanical rhythm of the localized life support scrubbers. It was no longer the harmonious, imperceptible hum of Von engineering. It was the desperate, rattling breath of a dying beast. His beast. He forced himself up, his bad knee screaming in protest, sending sharp spikes of white-hot pain up his thigh. His left arm, wrapped tightly against his chest, throbbed with a relentless, heavy rhythm. The blistered skin beneath the scorched fabric of his sleeve felt tight, leaking a slow, steady trickle of clear plasma that dried into stiff crusts. Every time he inhaled, his bruised ribs ground together. He was a walking catalogue of blunt force trauma, sustained only by a cocktail of fading adrenaline and stubborn spite. The station was dumb now, lobotomized. The AI that had been fighting his crude repairs was dead, leaving millions of individual systems completely isolated. They were blindly running their last programmed commands, without a central conductor to keep the orchestra in time. Cameron limped out of the server room and back into the main engineering bay. The absolute zero vacuum had stripped the room of its heat, leaving a biting, bitter frost across the deck plating. His breath plumed in the dim amber light. Without the central processing node, the automated stabilization thrusters were offline. He didn't need a diagnostic screen to tell him what that meant. He could feel it. It was a subtle shift in the inner ear, a microscopic slant to the deck that hadn't been there an hour ago. The station was situated in a high-orbit Lagrange point, above a massive, turbulent gas giant. Without the micro-adjustments of the thrusters, the station's massive bulk was slowly succumbing to orbital decay. Gravity, the silent, patient killer, was pulling them down. Cameron wiped a smear of soot and congealed blood from his forehead. He dragged his heavy tool bag toward the manual thruster overrides situated at the far end of the bay. The console was dead, its bioluminescent interface black and lifeless. He unlatched the heavy access panel beneath the console, exposing the raw physical actuators that controlled the fuel injection valves. The Von used a refined liquid plasma, highly volatile and incredibly efficient. The physical valves were massive, geared wheels designed to be turned by heavy, automated servo motors. Cameron wedged his heavy steel wrench into the spokes of the first valve wheel. He pulled. The wheel didn't budge. The frost had settled into the gears, locking the cold metal in place. He gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles corded and tight. He wrapped both hands around the wrench handle, planting his good leg against the bulkhead for leverage. He pulled with every ounce of strength left in his battered frame. His muscles trembled. His vision swam with grey static. He thought of his empty apartment in Neo-Chicago. He thought of the creditors. He thought of the deep, gnawing fear of failure that had driven him out into the blackness of space. He poured all that fear, all that bitter resentment into his hands. With a loud, metallic shriek, the ice in the gears fractured. The heavy valve wheel turned a fraction of an inch. "Move, you stubborn piece of scrap!" Cameron snarled, his voice a hoarse, ragged bark. He wrenched it again, and this time the wheel spun freely. A deep, resonant vibration shuddered through the floorboards as the primary fuel line opened, flooding the dormant thruster chambers with liquid plasma. He had to calculate the burn. A blind ignition could easily spin the station into an uncontrollable tumble, tearing the superstructure apart. He needed to know the exact duration of the thrust to counteract the orbital decay delta, without exceeding the structural shear limits. He pulled his grease pencil and dropped to the frost-covered floor, scribbling frantic equations onto the metal. He needed the change in semi-major axis over 1 revolution due to atmospheric drag, equating it to the impulsive maneuver. He estimated the mass of the lobotomized station, the cross-sectional area, and the local density of the upper thermosphere of the gas giant below. The math was brutal, requiring him to isolate the required burn time based on the known mass flow rate of the manual valves. He stared at the final number, 82 seconds. He needed to hold the ignition relay closed with his bare hands for exactly 82 seconds, or the station would either burn up in the atmosphere or tear itself in half. He grabbed the raw copper ignition wires, hanging loose from the shattered console. They were thick, industrial-grade cables, stripped at the ends. He had bypassed the digital safeties. This was raw, unfiltered current. Cameron wrapped the heavy copper wires around his hands. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting blood and frost. He slammed the raw wires together. The resulting electrical arc was blinding. It cracked like a bullwhip, sending a massive surge of voltage directly down the line. The station roared. It wasn't a mechanical hum. It was the deafening, bone-shaking thunder of liquid plasma igniting in the vacuum of space. The force of the acceleration hit Cameron like a physical blow. The artificial gravity was dead, leaving only the raw kinetic thrust to pin him against the deck. The metal groaned, screeching in protest as millions of tons of alien architecture were forcefully pushed against the grip of the gas giant. He watched the chronometer on his wrist. The numbers blurred. 20 seconds. The heat from the raw copper wires began to burn his palms. He smelled searing flesh but refused to let go. 40 seconds. The vibration was so violent it rattled the air from his lungs. 60 seconds. The hull plating above him shrieked, a terrifying sound of metal bending past its tolerance. 82. Cameron ripped the wires apart. The deafening roar cut out instantly, replaced by a heavy, ringing silence. The crushing force of acceleration vanished, leaving him floating gently in the microgravity of the cold bay. He had stabilized the orbit. The beast was sleeping, tethered safely in the dark. Cameron closed his eyes, letting the darkness take him, surrendering finally to the overwhelming gravity of his own exhaustion. Hours bled into days. Time lost its rigid mathematical structure, melting into a blurry, agonizing continuum of maintenance and survival. Cameron became a ghost, haunting a graveyard of his own making. He dragged his battered body through the freezing, fleshy corridors, a solitary creature of grease, sweat, and sheer willpower. His routine was brutal. Wake up on the hard deck of the engineering bay, drink 3 mouthfuls of the lukewarm, aluminum-tasting water from the jury-rigged condenser in hydroponics, check the pressure seals on his melted polymer hull patches, monitor the volatile, sparking bypass he had built for the main core. He was starving. The deep, hollow ache in his stomach had progressed from a sharp pain to a dull, constant nausea. His coveralls hung loosely on his heavy frame, the fabric stiff with dried blood, alien sap, and chemical burns. He had stopped looking at his left arm. The blistered skin had scabbed over into a dark, ugly mass, and he didn't possess the medical supplies to treat it properly. He just kept it wrapped in a torn piece of relatively clean fabric, ignoring the dull, radiating throb. The absolute silence of the station was the hardest thing to endure. When he had lived in Neo-Chicago, the noise had been constant. Sirens, rain hitting the synthetic glass, the muffled arguments of neighbors through paper-thin walls. He used to crave silence. He used to think isolation would be a sanctuary. Now, the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. It forced him to listen to his own thoughts, to the relentless, echoing catalogue of his regrets. He found himself talking aloud just to break the stillness. He explained complex fluid dynamic principles to the shattered conduits. He cursed the Von architects with elaborate, highly specific profanity. He apologized to his ex-wife, whispering words into the freezing dark that he had never had the courage to say to her face. On the 4th day, he returned to the communications spire. The climb was agony. His bad knee was swollen to the size of a grapefruit, locking up with every step. He hauled himself up the frozen rungs entirely with upper body strength, grunting with exertion. The comm center was just as he had left it, a freezing, devastated ruin of shattered crystal and severed fiber optics. The blocky Terran diagnostic terminal still sat on the deck, its monochrome green screen glowing faintly in the gloom. Cameron slumped against the bulkhead, his chest heaving. He stared at the manual override switch, stained with the dried brown rust of his own blood. He didn't want to press it. The cynical, exhausted part of his brain told him it was useless. Space was too vast. The sector was too remote. The Vaughn had abandoned this route for a reason. He was just a dying man tapping a telegraph key in an empty universe, wasting calories he couldn't afford to lose. But the stubborn engineer inside him, the man who refused to leave a broken valve unfixed, reached out. His trembling, calloused finger rested on the plastic key. He pressed it. Click. He fell back into the rhythm, tapping out the localized electromagnetic pulse. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. He tapped for an hour. His eyes drifted shut, his head lolling against the frozen bulkhead. He was slipping into the lethargic comfort of hypothermia again. It would be so easy to stop. Suddenly, the monochrome green screen of the terminal flickered. Cameron's eyes snapped open. The rhythmic, chaotic error codes that had been scrolling endlessly across the screen suddenly paused. The terminal clicked loudly, a harsh mechanical sound. A single line of text appeared on the green phosphor screen. Signal lock established. Handshake protocol initiated. Cameron stopped breathing. His heart hammered against his bruised ribs. A violent, painful rhythm. He stared at the screen, terrified that if he blinked, the words would vanish. A cruel hallucination brought on by starvation and cold. The screen cleared. Another line of text spooled across the glass. Unregistered transmission ping detected. This is United Terran Salvage Vessel Kodiak. Please identify. It wasn't the Vaughn. It wasn't an automated corporate drone. It was a human ship, a scrappy, ugly, heavy-duty salvage hauler, probably out here picking the bones of dead sectors. Cameron's hands shook so violently he could barely hit the keys on the terminal. He typed, his raw, bleeding fingers slipping on the plastic. Human contractor, Cameron, alone, station abandoned, core stabilized, require immediate evac. He hit send. The seconds stretched into eternity. He listened to the quiet, mechanical grinding of his station below him, waiting. The terminal clicked. Copy that, Cameron. We have your beacon. ETA 4 hours. Hold tight, buddy. How the hell did you keep that thing in orbit? A profound, staggering wave of emotion crashed over Cameron. It wasn't just relief. It was vindication. It was the sudden, undeniable proof that his suffering, his crude, ugly, brute force engineering had mattered. He typed his response, a bitter, genuine smile cracking his dry lips. Duct tape and spite. See you soon. Cameron leaned his head back against the freezing metal. He didn't feel the cold anymore. He didn't feel the pain. He listened to the ugly, rhythmic heartbeat of the alien station, the heavy, mechanical pulse of the bypasses, the hissing steam of the condenser, the deep, vibrating hum of the manual thrusters. The Vaughn had designed a masterpiece of elegant, fragile perfection, and they had abandoned it the moment the math didn't add up. Cameron had rebuilt it into a scarred, bleeding, heavily modified monster. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't optimal, but it was surviving. He looked around the ruined communications spire, the green glow of the terminal reflecting in his tired eyes. He realized with a quiet, undeniable certainty that he wasn't just a contractor anymore. He hadn't just fixed the station, he had conquered it. He had bled for it, burned for it, and torn it apart with his bare hands to force it to live. It wasn't a Vaughn way station anymore. It was his, and he would be waiting on the docking ring to welcome the Kodiak aboard. Cameron's survival didn't hinge on an epic battle or a stroke of destined genius. It hung on calloused hands, heavy wrenches, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to become a line item in an alien ledger. Humanity's greatest strength isn't our elegance, it's our grit in the face of the impossible. If you loved this deep dive into raw, unyielding human engineering, hit that like button to keep the station powered up. Share this with a fellow sci-fi fan, and don't forget to subscribe for the next chapter of Cameron's fight for survival.